I've been waking up at 5:30 in the morning for 11 years now. Not because I have to, because I want to. There's something about that hour. The city still dark, the house still quiet, the coffee finishing its first cycle before anyone else is awake that feels like mine. Just mine. A few minutes that belong to no one but me. I work as a cashier in the cafeteria at Riverside Elementary, here in Columbus, Ohio. I've worked there since I was 57. Some people hear that and tilt their heads slightly, the way people do when they're deciding whether to feel sorry for you. I don't mind. I stopped minding a long time ago. The children call me Miss Margaret. Every single morning, without exception, they come through that line with their little trays and they say, "Good morning, Miss Margaret," like it's a ritual, like I'm part of something important, and I suppose I am. You'd be surprised what a consistent, warm face at 7:15 in the morning does for a child who didn't eat breakfast at home. I notice those things. I've always noticed things. I notice when the bread delivery is short by half a case. I notice when the produce comes in soft on a Wednesday and we need to use it by Friday. I notice when one of the kitchen staff seems distracted, and I make a point to handle the register a little longer so they can catch their breath. Noticing is something I've done my whole life. It served me quietly and well. My son Devon is 34. His wife Carla is 32. They moved into my house 3 years ago, in the spring. My house. The one I've owned outright since 2009. The one I bought alone after a divorce that left me with very little, except a clear title and a decision to rebuild carefully. They were going to stay for 6 months, save money, get back on their feet after Devon lost a management position he'd held for 2 years. I didn't ask too many questions. He was my son. I said yes. That was 3 years ago. By last winter, things had shifted in ways that are difficult to describe quickly. They weren't dramatic shifts. They were the slow kind. The kind where one day you realize the refrigerator is always full of food you didn't buy, and no one asks before filling it. Where the TV in the living room is always on a channel you didn't choose. Where your mail gets stacked in a pile on the counter as though your name on the envelope is a mild inconvenience. Small things. But small things have a way of adding up to something much larger when they're never addressed. I want to tell you about the evening in February, a Tuesday, I believe when Devon said the sentence that I've thought about nearly every day since. We were at the kitchen table. I'd just come home from work, still in my uniform, the navy polo with the school district logo on the chest. I'd poured myself a glass of water and sat down for a moment before starting dinner. Devon was scrolling on his phone. Carla was watching something in the living room. He glanced up at my shirt. Then he looked back at his phone. Then, without looking up again, he said, "Mum, you should probably stop telling people you work in a cafeteria." It sounds kind of sad. I didn't say anything right away. I took a sip of water. I set the glass down. I looked at the table for a moment. Some people mistake silence for surrender. That was Devon's first and most significant miscalculation. I didn't argue with him that night. I didn't cry. I didn't explain myself or defend the work I do or the people I serve. I simply finished my glass of water, made dinner, and went to bed at my usual hour. But that night, before I slept, I opened the drawer in my nightstand where I keep a small brown folder. I hadn't opened it in about 8 months. I just wanted to confirm it was still there. It was. The folder was nothing fancy. A standard manila folder, a little worn at the edges, with a rubber band around it that I'd replaced twice over the years. Inside it were documents I'd been keeping organized since 2009. The deed to the house, the homeowner's insurance policy, a small savings account passbook from a credit union that Devon didn't know existed, a copy of my will, unsigned at the time, with a note I'd written to myself about updating it. I didn't read everything that night. I just held the folder for a moment, the way you hold something familiar to confirm it's still real. Then I put it back in the drawer, turned off the lamp, and lay in the dark for a while. I didn't sleep right away, but I wasn't upset, exactly. I was thinking, there's a difference. Let me go back a little. Not far, just enough to show you how we got here. The first memory that comes to me is from about 2.5 years ago, maybe 8 months after Devon and Carla moved in. It was a Saturday morning in early fall. I remember because the light through the kitchen window had that particular slant. It gets in October, low and golden, coming in at an angle across the counter. I had gotten up at my usual time and made coffee. I was standing at the sink, rinsing a bowl, when Carla came downstairs in her robe, looked at the coffee maker, and said, "We're almost out of the good coffee. Can you pick some up today?" Not, "We're almost out." Not, "I'll grab some later." Just, "Can you pick some up?" I said, "I'll see what I can do." She nodded and went back upstairs. I stood at the sink a moment longer, watching the water run over my hands, and I thought, at the time, I didn't think much of it. I filed it away the way I file most things, quietly, without comment. The second memory is from about a year after that. Devon had started doing better professionally by then, some contract work, a few clients, and I think that small improvement made him less careful about how he spoke to me. Comfortable people sometimes forget the conditions under which they became comfortable. He had a friend over one evening, someone I'd met once before. They were talking in the living room, and I came through to get something from the bookshelf. Devon's friend asked, "Is this your mum's place?" And Devon said, "Yeah, she lets us stay here. She lets us stay here." As though the arrangement were a kindness I extended, rather than a responsibility I had quietly absorbed. I took my book and went back to my room without saying anything. But I remembered the phrasing. I tend to remember phrasing. The third memory is more recent. Just a few weeks before, the Tuesday in February, when Devon made his comment about the cafeteria. I had come home on a Friday afternoon to find that the small writing desk in the front room, the one that had belonged to my mother, had been moved to the garage to make space for a new television stand that Devon and Carla had ordered without asking me. My mother's desk, in the garage. I went out and looked at it for a moment. It was sitting between a folding chair and a storage bin, slightly dusty already. I ran my hand along the top of it, the wood still smooth, still solid, and I made a note in my mind. Not an emotional note, a practical one. I thought, later I realized that moment mattered more than I understood. After the Tuesday comment, I gave myself a week before I did anything. That's always been my way. Reaction is loud and imprecise. Procedure is quiet and exact. I've lived long enough to know the difference between the two, and I've learned to trust the second one almost without exception. During that week, I went to work every morning. I greeted the children. I ran the register. I ate lunch with two women I've worked with for years. Patricia, who handles the hotline, and a younger woman named Sonia, who manages ordering. We talked about ordinary things. The weather had turned. One of the third-grade teachers had just announced she was retiring at the end of the year. Small, real things. I didn't mention Devon or Carla or the house. I wasn't ready to. And, besides, I hadn't decided anything yet. What I had decided was to verify. Before anything else, before any decision, any conversation, any action, I needed to confirm exactly what I had, what it was worth, and what my options looked like legally and financially. I'm a careful person. I don't move until I know the ground beneath me is solid. On a Thursday evening, 9 days after the Tuesday comment, I called a woman named Ruth Ansley. Ruth is a real estate attorney I'd met years ago through a neighbor. We weren't close, but I had her card in the brown folder. I keep cards from people who might one day be useful, without necessarily knowing when, and she had always struck me as someone who said exactly what she meant. I left her a voicemail. I told her I had some questions about property. I owned outright and wanted to understand my options. I didn't say anything else. She called back the next morning before I left for work. We made an appointment for the following Tuesday. Ruth Ansley's office was on the fourth floor of a modest building downtown, about 6 blocks from the Central Library. I took the bus, which I prefer. Parking downtown is expensive, and the bus gives me time to think without having to concentrate on traffic. I arrived 7 minutes early. The waiting area was quiet, 2 chairs. A small table with a plant on it that looked like it was genuinely cared for, which I appreciated. A detail like that tells you something about a person's office. Someone was paying attention to the small things. I felt at ease. Ruth came out herself to greet me. She was maybe 10 years younger than me, efficient in her movements, with reading glasses pushed up on her head. She shook my hand and brought me back to a tidy office with 2 windows overlooking the street below. We sat down. She had a yellow legal pad in front of her. She asked me to tell her the situation in whatever way felt natural. So I did. I told her about the house. That I had purchased it in 2009. That my name was the only name on the deed. That I had paid off the mortgage in full in 2017. And that my adult son and his wife had been living there for 3 years under an informal arrangement with no lease, no written agreement, and no financial contribution to the mortgage. Taxes, or utilities, beyond occasional grocery purchases that were frankly inconsistent. I told her about the comment Devon had made. Not because it was legally relevant, I understood it wasn't, but because it was the moment I decided to take stock of where things stood. Ruth listened without interrupting. She wrote a few things on her legal pad. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You own the property outright. There's no co-signer, no joint tenancy, no recorded interest from any other party." I said, "Correct." She nodded slowly. "Then your options are broader than you may realize." She explained the process clearly and without drama. Because Devon and Carla had no lease, no written agreement of any kind, they were considered what Ohio law calls at-will occupants. That status, she said, carried certain procedural requirements before they could be asked to leave. But those requirements were straightforward and manageable. She said the timeline, if handled properly, was predictable. Then she said something I want to share exactly as I remember it. She looked down at her legal pad, then back up at me and said, "The paperwork already has your name on it. Everything else is just process." I wrote that down in my own small notebook when I got home, not because I needed to, because it settled something in me. I want to tell you about Devon's first indication that something had changed, because it didn't come from me directly, and that's important to understand. About 2 weeks after my meeting with Ruth, I had contacted a real estate agent named Dennis, who had sold a house 2 doors down from mine 4 years earlier. I remembered him as someone who was organized and didn't waste words. I called him, explained I was considering listing the property, and asked him to come by for an informal walkthrough and a preliminary market assessment. He came on a Saturday morning while Devon was out and Carla was upstairs. I showed him through the house. He was professional, took notes on a small tablet, asked a few questions about the roof and the HVAC system, both of which I could answer accurately. He told me the market in our neighborhood was favorable. He gave me a preliminary number that was higher than I had expected, which I received without visible reaction. Though I want to be honest, I sat with that number for a long time after he left. Carla had come downstairs while Dennis was there. She asked who he was. In the casual way people ask questions when they assume they already know the answer. I said, "Someone I'm meeting with about the house." She looked at Dennis, then at me, then said, "Oh, okay," and went to the kitchen. She didn't ask a follow-up question. I think she assumed I meant something small, a repair estimate maybe, an insurance review, something administrative and minor. That assumption would prove costly. Dennis and I met formally the following week at his office. He brought comps comparable sales in the neighborhood over the last 18 months. He walked me through a listing strategy. We talked about timing, We talked about showings, about staging, about what I might need to address before going to market. He asked, gently, whether there were occupants in the house and whether they were aware of the plan. I said they were occupants, not tenants, that there was no lease, and that I was in the process of following the appropriate legal steps to provide proper notice. He nodded and didn't press further. He was a professional. He understood the situation without needing it, explained twice. Before I left his office, we had agreed on a listing date 6 weeks out. I took the bus home. The afternoon had turned grey and cool, the kind of Midwestern afternoon that feels like the city is settling in for something. I looked out the window the whole ride back and thought about the house, the way I'd first seen it, the way it looked the morning I signed for it, the particular smell of the rooms in winter. I wasn't sad, I want to be clear about that. I was something closer to resolved. When I got home, Devon was in the kitchen. He looked up and asked where I'd been. I said, running some errands. He nodded and looked back at his phone. That was the last ordinary evening we had in that house, though neither of us knew it at the time. Ruth had prepared the notice documents the week prior. I signed them on a Wednesday morning before work, at her office, in about 15 minutes. She walked me through each page without rushing. When we finished, she paper-clipped the set neatly and handed me a copy in a plain white envelope. I put the envelope in my bag, took the bus to Riverside Elementary, greeted the children, ran the register for 4 hours, ate lunch with Patricia and Sonia, and took the bus home. I placed the notice on the kitchen table that evening, weighted down by the salt shaker so it wouldn't slide. Devon found it around 7 o'clock. I was in my room reading when I heard him go quiet in the kitchen. Not a sound, exactly, but an absence of sound, which is its own kind of signal. Then I heard him call Carla's name. I turned a page and kept reading. The conversation that followed was not a calm one, at least not on their end. Devon knocked on my bedroom door and came in without waiting, which told me everything I needed to know about how the next few weeks were going to feel. He was holding the notice in one hand. His voice was controlled but tight, the way voices get when someone is working hard to sound reasonable while feeling the opposite. He said, "Mom, what is this?" I said, "It's a notice of intent to reclaim the property. Ruth Ansley prepared it. Her contact information is at the bottom if you have legal questions." He stared at me for a moment. Then he said, "You're not serious." I didn't answer that. There was nothing productive in answering it. He said, "You're upset about what I said, about the cafeteria thing. That's what this is." I said, "I'm not upset, Devon. I'm organized." Carla appeared in the doorway behind him. She looked at the paper, then at me. With an expression I recognized the particular look of someone recalibrating, trying to determine whether a situation is real or performative, whether they need to take it seriously or wait it out. I said, "You both have time to make arrangements. The timeline is in the document. Ruth can answer procedural questions." I'd suggest reading it carefully. Then I picked up my book again. Devon stood there a moment longer. Then he left. I heard them talking in low voices down the hall for most of the evening. I read 2 more chapters and went to sleep at my usual hour. The listing went live on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks later. Dennis had done good work. The photographs were clean and accurate. The description was straightforward. He had priced it in the upper range of the comps, which I had agreed to after reviewing the numbers myself. Within 48 hours, we had 4 inquiries and 2 showing requests. The first showing was on a Saturday afternoon. I want to tell you what that felt like, not emotionally, but practically, because I think it illustrates something important about what was happening in that house at that time. Devon and Carla were home when the buyers arrived. A couple, mid-30s, with a toddler who held his mother's hand the entire time. Dennis walked them through each room with the practiced ease of someone who has done this hundreds of times. He pointed out the updated kitchen, the natural light in the back bedroom, the condition of the floors. Devon sat at the kitchen table the entire time, not speaking, watching strangers open his mother's cabinets and look out his mother's windows. Carla had gone upstairs. That's when the room went quiet. Not literally. The buyers were talking, the toddler made small noises. Dennis was professionally cheerful. But something in the air of that house had shifted in a way that couldn't be walked back. I watched Devon's face during those 40 minutes, and I saw the moment it became real to him. Not the notice, not the listing, but this. Strangers in the kitchen. A child touching the countertop. A couple whispering to each other about whether the second bedroom was large enough. This was real. I had been in touch with the senior community office since mid-February, a small complex called Maplewood Court, about 2 miles from the elementary school, situated beside a city park with mature trees and a paved walking path. I had toured it twice before saying anything to anyone. The apartment was smaller than the house, by a significant measure. 1 bedroom, a modest kitchen, a living area with 2 windows that faced east. Morning light. I noticed that specifically the morning light. The monthly cost was within my budget, factoring in the proceeds from the house sale and my part-time income and the savings account Devon didn't know about. I had run the numbers 3 times on a yellow legal pad of my own, the way Ruth used the ones in her office. The math was sound. I signed the application on a Tuesday and received conditional approval by Friday of the same week. I didn't tell Devon or Carla. Around this time, I also began selling furniture. This is the part people sometimes find surprising, but it was entirely straightforward. I had purchased nearly every piece of furniture in that house myself, over many years, with my own money. I had receipts for some of it, and memory for the rest. Legally and practically, it was mine to sell. I listed pieces quietly, a few on an online marketplace, a few through a woman at my church who ran informal estate sales. The large items went first. The dining set, the living room sofa, a bookcase from the front room that I'd had since before Devon was in high school. Devon noticed the dining set was gone on a Wednesday evening and asked about it. I said I'd sold it. He said, "Where are we supposed to eat?" I said, "That's a reasonable thing to think about." He looked at me for a long moment. I think he was beginning to understand that I was not going to be redirected by frustration or managed by guilt. I had made a decision. I was executing it. Authority doesn't come from saying something first. It comes from having your name on the paperwork. An offer came in on the house 22 days after listing. It was close to asking price within a range Dennis had told me to expect from serious buyers. I reviewed it with Ruth that same afternoon. She walked me through the terms, the inspection contingency, the closing timeline, the escrow arrangement. I initialed where she indicated. I signed where my signature was required. Escrow doesn't recognize assumptions. It only recognizes documents. And every document in that transaction had my name on it, and only my name. Because that is how I had built this particular part of my life, carefully, quietly, and entirely on my own terms. Devon and Carla attempted a countermove around this time. Devon called Ruth's office directly to ask whether there was any way to contest the sale or delay the proceedings, given that he was a family member residing in the property. Ruth called me afterward to let me know. She told me what he'd asked, and then she told me what she'd told him. She said she had explained, professionally and without editorializing, that an at-will occupant has no legal standing to contest a property sale conducted by the sole owner. She said he'd gone quiet on the phone for a moment. Then he'd thanked her and hung up. The inspection was scheduled for a Monday morning at 9 o'clock. I had informed Devon and Carla the previous Thursday in writing a brief note left on the kitchen counter, the same way I had delivered the original notice. I had learned by then that written communication was cleaner than spoken communication in that house. It removed the opportunity for misremembering, for reinterpretation, for the particular kind of selective hearing that tends to occur when people are told things they don't want to hear. The note said the inspector would arrive at 9, that access to all rooms would be required, and that I would appreciate them being available or absent during that window. They were both home when the inspector arrived. I don't know whether that was deliberate or simply inertia. Either way, it didn't affect the process. The inspector was a methodical man named Gerald, older, unhurried, with a canvas bag of tools and a clipboard checklist that he worked through room by room with the quiet focus of someone who has done this particular thing thousands of times and has no opinion about it beyond accuracy. He checked the roof from the attic access. He tested every outlet. He ran the faucets, examined the water heater, looked at the furnace with a flashlight, and spent 12 minutes in the crawl space beneath the house without complaint. Devon followed him from room to room for the first 30 minutes, not speaking, just present in the way that people are present when they're trying to assert something without knowing exactly what they're trying to assert. Gerald didn't acknowledge it. He just kept working through his checklist. Eventually, Devon stopped following and went to sit in the kitchen. I made coffee and offered Gerald a cup when he came through. He accepted, thanked me, and kept moving. The inspection report came back 2 days later. Minor items, only a bathroom cork issue, one window with a slightly worn seal. Nothing that affected the sale. Dennis relayed the buyer's response. They were satisfied. We were moving forward. The closing date was set for 6 weeks out. I want to tell you what those 6 weeks felt like in that house, because the atmosphere had changed in a way that was difficult to ignore and impossible to reverse. Devon and Carla had begun making phone calls. I could hear fragments from my room in the evenings. Calls to Devon's brother in Cincinnati, who I gathered was not in a position to help. Calls that sounded like apartment inquiries. Voices dropping at the end of sentences, the way they do when someone has been told a number they weren't expecting. I didn't listen deliberately. Sound travels in an old house whether you invite it to or not. Carla had stopped speaking to me directly by the 3rd week. Not dramatically, there was no confrontation, no declared silence. She simply stopped initiating conversation and responded to mine with 1 or 2 words when necessary. I understood it. She was processing something difficult, and I was the person most associated with that difficulty. I didn't take it personally. I had done nothing to her that wasn't within my complete legal and moral right to do. Devon made one more attempt to reach me directly. It was a Sunday evening, about 3 weeks before closing. He knocked on my bedroom door this time. He waited and came in and sat in the chair by the window. He looked tired. Not angry anymore, just tired. He said, "Mom, is there any version of this where you don't sell?" I thought about the question honestly before answering. "That's always been my way," I said. "No, Devon, there isn't." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because of what I said about the cafeteria?" I said, "That was one moment, but it wasn't the first moment, and it wasn't an isolated one. It was the moment I decided to stop waiting for things to change on their own." He didn't respond to that directly. He looked at the floor for a while. Then he said, "I didn't think you were serious." I said, "I know." That was the truest and most useful thing either of us said during that entire period. "I didn't think you were serious." It explained everything. The 3 years of slow accumulation, the furniture moved without asking, the groceries assumed, the mail stacked, the desk in the garage. He hadn't thought I was serious. He had mistaken my patience for permission, my silence for acceptance, my consistency for passivity. Some people mistake quiet for weakness. That is almost always an error they only make once. 2 weeks before closing, I began packing. I was selective about it. Deliberate. I had lived in that house for 16 years, and I was not sentimental about most of it. Furniture was furniture. Objects were objects, but there were things that mattered, and I knew exactly which ones they were. My mother's desk had been brought back inside from the garage by that point. I had moved it myself on a Saturday morning, while Devon and Carla were still asleep, carrying it in 2 pieces through the back door and setting it up in my bedroom where it stayed until the movers came. I packed the photographs first. 3 boxes of them albums, loose prints, a few framed ones from the walls. Then my books, which filled 4 more boxes. Then clothing, kitchen items I had bought and used for decades, a lamp from my bedroom that had been with me since before the house. I arranged for a small moving company to come the day before closing. 2 men, efficient and careful. They wrapped everything properly and loaded the truck in about 3 hours. Devon watched from the living room doorway as they carried boxes through the hall. He didn't offer to help. I didn't ask him to. The closing itself was unremarkable in the way that important procedural moments often are. A conference room. A table with documents arranged in order. Dennis on one side, the buyer's agent on the other, Ruth beside me. The buyers themselves, the couple from the first showing, without their toddler, this time sat across from me and signed their portions with the careful concentration of people doing something significant for the first time. I signed where I was asked to sign. I initialed where initialing was required. Ruth turned each page for me with a quiet efficiency that I appreciated. When the final document was executed, the escrow officer, a composed woman named Linda, who had clearly done this 10,000 times, gathered the pages into a neat stack and said, "That's everything. Congratulations." I thanked her. Then I picked up my copy of the closing documents, put them in my bag, and walked out into the afternoon. The last morning in the house, I woke up at 5:30, out of habit, I suppose. Or maybe out of something else, a kind of muscle memory that doesn't know how to do anything other than meet the day at its earliest point. I made coffee in the kitchen with the small percolator I had packed last, specifically so I could have it that morning. The house was mostly empty by then. The rooms had that particular echo quality that unfurnished spaces get sounds landing differently, the air feeling slightly cooler and more honest without furniture to absorb it. I stood at the kitchen window with my cup and looked out at the backyard. The old maple in the corner was beginning to show the first pale green of early spring. I had watched that tree from that window for 16 years. I didn't feel what I expected to feel. I had prepared myself for something heavier, and it didn't arrive. What I felt instead was something quieter and more difficult to name. A kind of completion, maybe. The sense of a thing finished that had needed finishing for longer than I had fully admitted to myself. Devon came downstairs around 7. He looked like he hadn't slept well, which I believed. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the empty counters. For a moment, the spaces where appliances had been, the wall where the calendar used to hang, and then he looked at me. He said, "Why didn't you just tell us you felt disrespected?" I had been expecting some version of that question for weeks. I had thought about how to answer it honestly, without being unkind, and I had found what I believed was the true answer. I said, "I did, Devon, many times. In small ways and impatient ways and in quiet ways. You just didn't hear it, so eventually I stopped saying it and made a decision instead." He stood there for a moment. I think he was going to say something more, but he didn't. There wasn't much left to say that would change the shape of what had already happened. We were past the point where words were the operative currency. Carla came down a few minutes later. She looked at me briefly, then looked away. I poured the rest of my coffee into the sink, rinsed the percolator, and packed it into the last box by the door. The movers had already taken everything to Maplewood Court the previous afternoon. All that remained in the house were Devon and Carla's belongings, their furniture, their boxes, their version of a life they had built inside a structure that had never belonged to them. They had 30 days from closing to make their own arrangements. Ruth had made sure that timeline was clearly documented. Dennis had made sure the new owners understood the situation. Everything was in order. I picked up the last box. I picked up my 2 suitcases, which were standing by the front door where I had left them the night before. I looked around the entryway once the original woodwork, the light fixture I had chosen myself in 2011, The floor I had refinished twice, and then I opened the front door and walked out. I did not look back at the house. Not because I was being dramatic about it, but simply because everything I needed from it was already with me. The cab to Maplewood Court took 14 minutes. My apartment was on the second floor, east-facing, the way I had requested. The movers had placed everything according to the diagram I had given them, the day before my mother's desk. Under the east window, the books along the interior wall, the lamp from my bedroom on the small table beside the bed. It looked, already, more like a home than that house had felt in quite some time. I unpacked the percolator first, made a fresh pot, opened the east window slightly, and listened to the neighborhood quieter than I was used to, in a way that felt earned rather than empty. Then I made a cup of tea, put on my coat, and walked the half block to the park. I want to tell you what that park looked like that morning, because I think it matters. It was still early enough that the light was coming in low through the trees, the same kind of morning light I had noticed when I first toured the apartment. The light that had been one of the quiet reasons I chose that particular unit on that particular floor. There were a few other people out, a man walking a dog at an unhurried pace, two older women on a bench near the fountain, talking with the ease of people who have known each other long enough not to need to perform anything for one another. I found a bench a little further along the path, facing east, with a view of the tree line and a sliver of the sky above it. I sat down. I wrapped both hands around my tea. I thought about Devon's question, "Why didn't you just tell us?" And I thought about my answer, and I decided I had said it correctly. I had told them. In the way that patient people tell things, which is not always with words, and which is not always received, and which eventually exhausts itself and becomes something else entirely. Becomes procedure, becomes documentation, becomes a signature on a page that only has one name on it. I thought about the children at Riverside Elementary, who would greet me on Monday morning with their small trays and their cheerful rituals, entirely unconcerned with whether my job sounded sad to anyone. I thought about Patricia and Sonia, and the ordinary lunch conversations I had missed during the busier weeks of all this. I thought about Ruth, who had said the paperwork already has your name on it, with the calm assurance of someone who understands that property and identity are not as separate as people sometimes pretend. And I thought about the folder, the worn manila folder with the rubber band, which was now in the top drawer of my mother's desk, under the east window, in my apartment, in my name, in my life. Some people mistake silence for surrender. They see patience and read passivity. They see a woman who wakes at 5:30 and takes the bus and serves children breakfast and comes home without complaint. And they see someone who can be slowly, quietly moved to the edges of her own life without consequence. That is almost always a miscalculation. I didn't sell a house, I bought my freedom. And I paid for it, the way I've paid for everything that's mattered carefully, quietly, and entirely on my own terms. If stories about quiet decisions and long patience resonate with you, you're welcome to stay.